7 years. 7 years I had spent building a life with Carter that felt straight out of a glossy magazine. We weren't just married, we were a perfectly balanced equation. I, the successful freelance graphic designer, found an artistic release in crafting brands and visuals for my clients. Carter, the steady accountant, provided the grounding structure that kept our world from spinning too fast. We had the cozy, sun-drenched apartment on the 10th floor, 2 fat, lazy tabby cats, and the kind of easy laughter that made strangers think we were still on our honeymoon. Every memory from the day he proposed, on a windy cliffside, to our quiet Saturday mornings reading the paper, was etched in my mind as proof that I had chosen wisely. I was happy. I was secure. I was whole. Then came the flash of chrome, and the sickening, grinding sound of metal against metal. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of mild day in early autumn where the air felt crisp and promising. I was on my way back from a meeting that had just landed me the biggest contract of my career. The radio was playing my favorite 90s era power ballad, and I was tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, my mind already buzzing with design concepts. I remember glancing in the rearview mirror just as a beat-up pickup truck, driven by a man completely engrossed in his phone, swerved into my lane. There was no time to brake, no time to scream, only a blinding, horrifying impact that tossed the world around me like a sock in a washing machine. Silence. Then, a high-pitched ringing in my ears that blocked out the distant siren wails. The smell of gasoline and burnt rubber filled the crushed cabin of my small sedan. I couldn't move. A searing, white-hot agony shot through both my legs. An immediate, profound pain unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just a break. It felt like demolition. My entire lower body felt disconnected, a useless weight trapped beneath the mangled dashboard. A stranger's face appeared in the shattered window, his expression a mask of horror. "Stay still, ma'am. The ambulance is here," he shouted. I tried to answer, tried to tell him where it hurt, but all that escaped my lips was a weak, pathetic gasp. The subsequent hours were a blur of sterile white rooms, the urgent murmur of medical jargon, and the paralyzing fear that gripped my soul. The surgeon's words, delivered with grim professionalism, were the final nails in the coffin of my former life. Catastrophic bilateral fractures of the femur. Both legs are severely damaged. Will operate immediately, but you're facing 6 to 8 months of recovery. Full mobility is uncertain. Uncertain. That single word echoed the devastation the crash had brought. When Carter finally arrived at the hospital, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and, yes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. He rushed to my side, gripping my hand tightly. "Oh, Chloe, my God, we'll get through this, baby. I promise, we will figure this out together," he murmured, stroking my hair. He was my anchor, my port in the terrible storm. His promise, made then amidst the antiseptic smell and the beeping machines, was the one thing I clung to as they wheeled me into surgery. I truly believed him. That was my first mistake. I believed the man who vowed to nurse me back to health would stay the same man who stood at my bedside, unaware that the real accident, the one that would shatter my spirit, had not been on the road, but was waiting for me at home. The hospital discharged me after 10 agonizing days, sending me back to the familiar comfort of our apartment. It should have felt like salvation, but it immediately felt like a cage. My legs were encased in cumbersome casts, making any movement a monumental, sweating effort. I was tethered to the electric wheelchair Carter had begrudgingly acquired, a constant, physical reminder of my sudden vulnerability. I desperately needed help with everything: dressing, bathing, even shifting my weight to relieve the pressure that quickly became unbearable. For the first few days, Carter maintained the veneer of the dedicated husband. He helped me into the shower, prepared bland but edible meals, and tucked me into bed. He garnered so much praise from my mother and father during their visits, acting the part of the devoted caregiver perfectly. "He's a saint, Chloe. You're lucky to have him," my mom whispered to me one afternoon. I agreed then, filled with a deep, weary gratitude. But the applause stopped when the audience left. The shift in his attitude was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, chilling fade. It was like watching a color photo slowly drain into black and white. The casual touches stopped. The spontaneous jokes vanished. Within a single week of being home, Carter stopped asking how I was and started sighing loudly whenever I asked for anything. His sighs were heavy, dramatic exhalations that felt like physical blows. They conveyed exhaustion, annoyance, and, worst of all, resentment. "Carter, could you just pass me my laptop? I need to respond to a client," I asked one evening, trying to sound as casual as possible. He was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, a dark look crossing his face before he even looked up. "Can't you wait 5 minutes? I just sat down," he muttered, his voice flat. He finally stood, grabbed the computer, and practically shoved it onto my lap. The motion jarred my legs, sending a sharp, stabbing ache right through the bone. I bit back a cry. His complaints became bolder. He whined about the cost of the home health aid I needed for a few hours each day, even though my insurance covered most of it. He grumbled about the smell of my pain medication, claiming it gave him a headache. He began to stay out later and later, citing endless emergency meetings or complex spreadsheets at his accounting firm. "I have to work late," he'd announce, barely making eye contact, while grabbing his jacket. "It's high pressure right now, you understand." Did I understand? Yes, I understood what high pressure was. It was trying to pivot a 300-pound body into a seated position, using only my arms, while praying the casts didn't slip. It was the daily, soul-crushing humiliation of needing another person to perform the most basic human functions. The truth was, Carter wasn't just late. He was absent. One Friday night, I was watching a documentary alone, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The clock on the wall read 11 o'clock. Carter hadn't called, hadn't texted, and hadn't answered my single, tentative message asking when he'd be back. Lying there, helpless and ignored, a cold, hard knot began to form in my gut. It was a realization, sharp and undeniable, that the man who had promised to stand by me in sickness was already halfway out the door. The perfection of our 7-year marriage had been based entirely on my ability to be independent, whole, and convenient. Now that I was none of those things, I was merely a burden. The man I loved was growing to despise me, and the emotional distance felt deeper than the thousands of miles he claimed to be traveling for work. Something was terribly wrong, and it wasn't just my fractured femurs. Suspicion, once planted, is a toxic weed that grows relentlessly. My friend Jenna tried to water the seeds of doubt, too. She was my lifeline, visiting frequently despite my protests that my situation was too messy. Jenna noticed the subtle changes before I allowed myself to fully acknowledge them. "He smells different, Chloe. Like, expensive different," she commented one afternoon, narrowing her eyes as Carter quickly ushered her out the door. She pointed out his sudden interest in designer cologne, his meticulous grooming, and the brand new unworn shirts that appeared in his closet. Most damningly, he now carried his phone everywhere, clutching it like a vital organ, always face down. I tried to dismiss it all. I told myself, his work really was stressful. I convinced myself the scent was a gift he'd bought himself, a small indulgence. But the truth gnawed at the edges of my rational mind, turning my stomach into a coiled mass of anxiety. The crushing weight of my physical confinement was now compounded by this sickening, internal dread. The final hammer blow landed 8 weeks after the crash. It was a cold night, the kind that made the silence in the apartment feel heavy and oppressive. I was struggling to read a book, my pain medication making the words swim. I heard the unmistakable sound of the key turning in the lock. It was just past 10 o'clock. But there were 2 sets of footsteps, 2 voices murmuring intimately in the hallway. My blood ran cold. The dread immediately crystallized into terrifying certainty. "Carter," I called out, my voice trembling, sounding smaller than I intended. The hallway light flicked on, and they stood silhouetted in the doorway of the living room. Carter, looking disheveled but utterly unashamed, and next to him, a woman whose face swam into focus. Vanessa, an ex-girlfriend from our early dating years. She was the antithesis of my current state, perfectly put together, wearing a dress that was far too elegant for our casual apartment. My heart didn't just sink. It plummeted, taking all the air from the room. The pain in my legs was instantly dwarfed by a profound, seismic ache in my chest. All the coldness, the late nights, the resentment, it suddenly made a horrific, ugly sense. What is she doing here? I managed, pushing myself up slightly in the chair. Carter rolled his eyes, a gesture of sheer boredom that hit me harder than any punch. "Oh, come on, Chloe. Did you really think I could manage 6 months of this? Of you?" He gestured dismissively toward my wheelchair and casts, as if pointing out a stain on the carpet. Vanessa stepped forward, a smug, contemptuous smirk playing on her lips. "He needs someone who can actually keep up with him, Chloe. Someone who isn't stuck in bed 24 hours a day." That was the moment the residual, weak part of me, the wife who wanted to weep and beg, died. All that remained was a stark, burning core of fury. "Get out, Vanessa," I ordered, my voice low and steady, startling even myself. "This is my apartment. My name is on the lease." Carter let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You're worried about a lease? Look at yourself. You're completely useless now," he spat, the cruel word hanging in the air like poison. "Every part of you is broken and worthless. You can't even satisfy me anymore." His words, useless, worthless, hit me like bullets. They weren't just insults. They were a complete dismissal of my identity, my career, my worth as a human being. But instead of triggering tears, they triggered clarity. The shock was replaced by an icy, absolute resolve. I looked at the broken man standing before me and realized I wasn't married to a husband. I was married to a cruel, selfish stranger. And that stranger was about to regret every single word he had ever uttered. The game had changed, and I knew exactly what my next move would be. This was no longer a marriage. It was a war, and I was just recruiting my army. His laughter died in his throat the moment he saw the look on my face. It was a look devoid of tears, stripped bare of fear, and utterly cold. My resolution, born in the wreckage of his cruel words, was immediate and absolute. I didn't waste another breath on him, or the woman who stood smirking beside him. They were noise, distractions. My focus was already on the intricate, silent chess game I was about to play. "Vanessa, I mean it. Leave now," I stated, my voice a quiet, flat command that nonetheless carried significant weight. She hesitated, looking to Carter for support. "Carter, you can stay tonight, but understand this. You will sleep on the couch, and you will not touch me. If you cross that line, I will call the police, and file a restraining order right now. Your choice." The threat was real, and the sudden shift in my demeanor from helpless invalid to focused opponent must have registered. Vanessa, visibly rattled, quickly gathered her coat and handbag, whispering a frantic goodbye to Carter before slipping out the door. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the worry of my wheelchair's motor as I turned it toward the desk. Carter stared, his expression a mixture of confusion and residual arrogance. He likely expected me to break down once his mistress was gone, to collapse into hysterics, and beg for his forgiveness or his understanding. But I didn't afford him the satisfaction. I reached for my phone and immediately texted the first person I trusted implicitly. "Jenna." I kept the message short and sharp. "Emergency. Need immediate help. Do not let Carter see you. Meet me at your place tomorrow morning." My next call was the critical one. I pulled up the contact for Richard Petton, my family's estate lawyer. Richard was a man in his 60s, renowned for his discretion and his sharp legal mind. He had managed my grandmother's trust and handled the disbursement of my inheritance, the very funds that had paid the initial, significant deposit on our apartment. The clock on the wall read almost 11:30 p.m., but I knew Richard would answer. "Richard, it's Chloe. I need to file for divorce. Effective immediately. I need you to protect my premarital assets, specifically the apartment and the inheritance funds." I spoke clearly, recounting the evening's events with clinical detachment, omitting none of Carter's brutal words. Richard's normally calm voice hardened. He advised me to take 2 immediate, crucial steps before he could officially file the papers. First, I had to secure every penny of the inheritance that remained in our joint accounts. Money received as a gift or inheritance prior to the marriage was generally protected, but not if it was fully commingled. He instructed me on how to open a new, private account at a different bank first thing in the morning and transfer every protected dollar. Second, he stressed the urgent need for irrefutable proof of Carter's infidelity and neglect, stating, "We need more than your word against his, Chloe. We need documentation that leaves no room for doubt." Hanging up, I felt a deep, slow burn of purpose, replacing the icy shock. My tears were still absent, replaced by a steely determination. I looked at Carter, who had finally retreated to the couch, with a sullen expression, and realized he wasn't just a cheat. He was a liability, and his carelessness was about to become my greatest weapon. The first stage of my elegant retaliation had begun, and it started not with anger, but with financial and legal strategy. My vulnerability was my shield, and my documented truth would be the sword. The next morning, I acted with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate executive closing a hostile merger. My initial move was financial, exactly as Richard had directed. I called a taxi, enduring the difficult, painful transfer into the vehicle, and instructed the driver to take me to a bank, far across town, a branch Carter would never think to check. With the help of the kind bank manager, I opened a new account solely in my name, a fortress for the money my grandmother had specifically designated for my future. I moved every single dollar of that inheritance out of our joint account, leaving behind only the small, residual sum that represented my equitable share of our shared savings. By noon, my legal armor was polished and secure. The second, and far more emotionally draining, task was the collection of hard evidence. This was where Jenna's loyalty shone brightest. She arrived after Carter left for his supposed work emergency, bringing with her not flowers or soup, but a small, unassuming black backpack, containing sophisticated surveillance equipment. Jenna, an amateur security enthusiast, thanks to her tech-savvy younger brother, knew exactly what was required. She had brought 2 miniature high-definition cameras designed to look like simple air purifiers. We worked slowly, meticulously, moving only when Carter's absence was guaranteed. Jenna's brother had provided step-by-step instructions. We positioned the first camera in the living room, ensuring a clear, wide shot of the main seating area and the front door, the very spot where Carter and Vanessa had stood. The second camera was hidden discreetly in the kitchen. Capturing the primary route he would take to and from the bedroom, the route that clearly bypassed me, his injured wife, in the living room. It was heartbreaking work, turning my sanctuary into a stakeout, but every click and whir of the installation was a necessary step toward freedom. The cameras weren't just for capturing the affair. They were about capturing the neglect. Richard had emphasized that winning the divorce settlement, especially avoiding spousal support to Carter, hinged on proving not just infidelity, but the cruel abandonment of his spousal duties when I was at my most vulnerable. My physical paralysis was about to become my most powerful witness. I also made sure to photograph my medical charts, the empty spaces in the refrigerator where food I couldn't reach should have been, and the dust collecting on my medical equipment tall, visual proof of his dereliction. Over the next 3 weeks, the digital evidence accumulated. I forced myself to review the footage every evening after Carter was asleep. I watched him saunter in late, ignore my quiet greeting, and head straight to the fridge to grab a beer before disappearing into the spare room, where he now slept. I watched him receive calls from Vanessa, the screens glowing in the dark, the intimate whispers caught by the sensitive microphones. The painful documentation of his emotional abuse and physical abandonment was the most agonizing part of my recovery, but it also fueled my vengeance. One particular night, the footage showed Carter sitting on the couch, openly texting Vanessa. He laughed at something she wrote, a genuine, easy sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. Then, the camera caught him looking over at me, asleep in my wheelchair where I'd drifted off, waiting for him, and a shadow of disgust crossed his face before he quickly returned to his phone. That image, that look of pure, unadulterated contempt sealed my resolve. This was more than enough. My proof was undeniable, and soon, it would be his undoing. I burned the evidence onto an encrypted drive and handed it over to Richard, feeling the exhilarating coldness of absolute control. The time for the direct confrontation was drawing near. With the digital evidence safely stored with Richard, I felt a new sense of power. It wasn't the brute force of confrontation, but the quiet, strategic strength of being perfectly prepared. Richard's instructions for the next phase were clear: create a final, recorded incident that demonstrated not only the infidelity but a direct threat to my personal safety within my own legally protected residence. The opportunity came on a dreary Saturday afternoon, exactly 1 week after I had delivered the encrypted drive. Carter informed me he was going out with the guys, but his nervous fidgeting and the freshly ironed shirt told a different story. I knew he was meeting her. I set my trap and waited. At precisely 7 o'clock in the evening, the familiar sound of his key in the lock, followed by 2 sets of voices, alerted me. This time, I was ready. I wheeled my chair into the hallway, positioning myself under the gaze of the living room camera, ensuring I was centered and clearly visible, a perfect portrait of vulnerable defiance. Carter and Vanessa stopped dead in their tracks. Vanessa, emboldened by his constant presence and perhaps a few glasses of wine, didn't bother hiding her contempt. "Oh, it's still here," she sneered, referring to me as an inanimate object. She walked past Carter, entering the living room as if she owned the place, and started flipping through the mail on our entry table. "This is my home, Vanessa. You need to leave now." I repeated the phrase, my voice steady, my mind focusing entirely on the script I was writing for the police report. She laughed a nasty, grating sound. "And what are you going to do about it, crippled? Roll after me." Her casual cruelty was breathtaking. She then pointed at my heavily cast legs. "See, Carter, useless. She can't even reach the phone to call for help." That was the cue. That direct, documented moment where they both acknowledged my defenselessness, and used it to establish dominance in my space. "Carter, I am giving you one final chance to instruct your guest to leave my property," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment at being cornered. "Don't be dramatic, Chloe. She's not going anywhere. You need to stop making things difficult." He stepped closer to me, attempting to intimidate me with his height, violating my personal space. The sheer arrogance of the man, refusing to acknowledge my legal rights, infuriated me. Without pausing, without breaking eye contact, I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out my cell phone. "This is 911. I am reporting a home invasion. I am physically disabled and confined to a wheelchair, and 2 unauthorized individuals have entered my residence. I feel threatened." I spoke clearly, enunciating every word, making sure the operator heard the entire context. Carter's bravado immediately collapsed. His jaw dropped. "Chloe, stop. What are you doing?" he hissed, realizing the serious legal jeopardy he was in. Vanessa, however, panicked. The mention of the police was enough to send her scurrying toward the door. She knew she was the liability. She was gone in a flash, leaving Carter alone, scrambling, and bewildered. When the 2 uniformed officers arrived less than 10 minutes later, they found me, the injured party, calmly sitting in my wheelchair, and Carter, the panicked aggressor, standing awkwardly by the sofa. The officers were professional and thorough. After reviewing the lease, clearly in my name, and noting the recent police report from the car accident which detailed my injuries, they determined the situation to be a legitimate domestic disturbance where the primary resident felt unsafe. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Carter's agitated, sputtering explanations. Because I stated that I feared for my physical safety with him still in the home, the officers informed Carter he was legally required to leave the premises immediately. He was allowed a single, supervised trip to the bedroom to grab a small bag of essentials. As he stumbled past my wheelchair, his eyes held not just anger, but a raw dawning terror. His perfect, comfortable life was officially over. Watching the police escort him out, shutting the door on the stranger, who was once my husband, I felt a deep, purifying wash of cold satisfaction. The battlefield was cleared. The physical trauma was still excruciating, but the emotional wound had finally begun to heal. With Carter gone, the apartment, once a suffocating prison of my injury and his contempt, became a peaceful sanctuary. The silence was golden, punctuated only by the gentle clicking of my own keyboard as I worked. I hired a new, cheerful aide who actually cared, and focused entirely on the upcoming legal battle, which, thanks to my meticulous planning, was shaping up to be less of a battle and more of a decisive, strategic victory. Richard Pitone, my lawyer, was ecstatic with the evidence I had provided. "Chloe," he remarked, during a phone call, his voice booming with confidence. "You have given us a case that is virtually unassailable. We have the proof of infidelity, the documented neglect of a vulnerable spouse, and the police report showing he was removed from your legal residence. We are going straight to mediation. He has zero leverage." The mediation process began just a few weeks later. I attended via video conference from my home office, sitting poised in my chair, dressed professionally, maintaining an expression of quiet determination. Carter, sitting across the table from Richard and his own lawyer, looked haggard and utterly defeated. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped. Gone was the arrogant entitlement that defined his last days in the apartment. Carter's lawyer opened with a few standard demands: a substantial portion of the apartment's equity, a share of my retirement savings, and at least 2 years of spousal support, citing my current limited earning capacity due to the accident. It was a laughable attempt at a claim, a final grab for my financial security. Then, Richard went to work. He didn't shout. He simply laid out the facts, backed by documented evidence. He began by addressing the apartment, which Carter desperately wanted. Richard presented the original purchase documents, clearly showing that 70% of the down payment came from my protected, premarital inheritance fund, making his equity claim negligible. The paperwork was ironclad, leaving his lawyer speechless. Next came the issue of spousal support. This was the crux of my elegant revenge. Richard pulled out the transcript from the security footage, then played the audio clip itself. The courtroom heard Carter's voice, clear and cold, stating, "You are truly useless now. Every part of you is broken and worthless." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The air in the room seemed to solidify. Carter flinched violently, his head snapping down in shame. His own lawyer looked utterly betrayed, realizing his client had withheld the most crucial, damaging piece of evidence. Richard then calmly paired that recording with the police report detailing how Carter had left me, the worthless and disabled spouse, neglected and feeling threatened in my own home, forcing police intervention. "My client," Richard stated, his voice resonating with cool authority, "has a significant, thriving freelance business, proving her earning capacity is not only intact but growing." Carter, on the other hand, abandoned his wife during her darkest hour and verbally abused her, calling her useless. "Not only do we oppose any request for spousal maintenance, but we could pursue a claim for punitive damages based on emotional distress and abandonment." The negotiation collapsed immediately. Carter's lawyer, recognizing the futility of fighting a case where his client was both the villain and financially exposed, pushed him to accept the inevitable. In the end, Carter received only his meager personal items, his depreciating old car, and a minuscule portion of the shared savings, a mere $3,000. I retained the apartment, the entirety of my inheritance, my successful business, and, most importantly, my dignity. The divorce was finalized in less than 9 weeks. As the paperwork came through, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound sense of closure and the liberating weight of absolute independence. I was free, and I was armed. The finalization of the divorce didn't just end a marriage. It initiated a profound internal rebirth. With Carter's toxicity removed from my life, I felt an instantaneous, powerful surge of clean energy. The anger I had held onto, that cold, surgical determination, didn't dissipate. Instead, it transformed, becoming the most potent fuel for my physical recovery. Every single muscle ache, every searing stretch, during physical therapy, was a direct rebuttal to his cruel decree, worthless, useless. I would spend the rest of my life proving those labels utterly, spectacularly wrong. My focus became laser sharp. My physical therapist, Maria, was an absolute godsend. She noticed the new intensity in my eyes and tailored my rehabilitation to match my ferocious resolve. Where I had once approached the exercises with resignation, I now attacked them with ferocity. Another set, Maria. I can take it. I'd grit out through clenched teeth, pushing past the burning agony in my reconstructed legs. I thought of the video footage of Carter's disgust, and that memory alone added 10 pounds to my leg press. My recovery timeline, which the surgeons had predicted would be slow and challenging, became an accelerated blur. 7 months after the crash, a milestone I had dreaded, I stood for the first time without the aid of the parallel bars. I still relied on a sleek, carbon fiber cane, but the sheer emotional power of standing tall, of feeling my own weight on my own 2 feet, was intoxicating. I wept then, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization of my own strength. I wasn't a victim. I was a survivor, rebuilding myself from the skeleton up. Professionally, my design business, which had languished during the initial weeks of despair, roared back to life. Freed from the emotional drain of Carter's resentment, my creativity flourished. I took on challenging, innovative projects, channeling the precision I had used in my legal planning into my work. My client list expanded quickly. My confidence was palpable, and soon, my income surpassed what Carter and I had earned together in our best years. The irony was a sweet, satisfying bomb. I was generating enormous wealth while moving forward, thriving precisely because of the circumstances he thought would destroy me. The apartment itself underwent a subtle but significant change. I repainted the walls, discarding the bland neutral shades Carter preferred for deep blues and vibrant greens that reflected my own artistic spirit. I sold his bulky, oppressive furniture and replaced it with light, functional pieces that accommodated my ongoing needs but felt modern and airy. I had reclaimed my space, turning the cage into a sophisticated, independent sanctuary. By the 10th month mark, I finally shed the cane. It was a day of quiet celebration. I walked across the living room carpet, slow and steady, taking careful, independent steps, feeling the solid connection between my mind and my body. It was a tangible victory, a profound reclaiming of my autonomy. That evening, I picked up the heavy, old-fashioned briefcase Richard had used during the mediation. Inside, nestled beneath the divorce papers, was a printout of the final contract, signed by a very unhappy Carter. I took a deep breath, and tossed all the papers, the rage, the fear into the shredder. I was done looking back. My life was no longer defined by the man who called me worthless, but by the woman who rebuilt her entire world. The transformation was not just physical or financial. It was complete. I had spent months meticulously scrubbing Carter from every aspect of my life, financially, legally, and emotionally. His name was no longer a wound, just a faded scar. My focus remained strictly forward, on my burgeoning business and my incredible physical momentum. I genuinely believed I had seen the last of him. Yet, life, or perhaps the universe itself, had a dramatic final act prepared. It was almost a year after the police had escorted him out, and 5 months since the final divorce decree. I was working late one evening, designing a new logo for a startup, when I heard a timid, almost apologetic knock at the door. I checked the peephole, and my blood ran cold, not with fear, but with weary annoyance. Standing there, looking utterly miserable and defeated, was Carter. I opened the door only slightly, keeping the security chain firmly fastened. What do you want, Carter? My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held a desperate shifty quality. Chloe, please, can I talk to you? Just for 5 minutes. I messed up. I know I messed up, he pleaded, his voice cracking with vulnerability I knew was entirely manufactured. I leaned against the doorframe, forcing him to address my Ken, the physical marker of his betrayal that I still kept nearby, even if I no longer needed it constantly. You had your chance to talk during mediation. You chose to call me worthless instead. Speak quickly, or I'm shutting the door. He launched into a clumsy performance, detailing his sorrow, his sleepless nights, and the crushing realization of what he had lost. But the veneer of remorse shattered when he reached the core of his visit. He paused, swallowed hard, and finally admitted the truth. Vanessa. She left me, Chloe. And it's worse than that. She ran a whole investment scam. She took $30,000 from me. It was all the money I had left. The money I borrowed from my parents to start over. She just vanished. I'm bankrupt. My friend kicked me out. I have nowhere to go. The revelation was stunning. I hadn't expected mere financial ruin. I hadn't expected a swindle of this magnitude. I fought the urge to laugh a sharp, hysterical sound that would have betrayed my cool exterior. Instead, I let a silence hang between us, thick with the weight of his pathetic, self-inflicted misery. He was seeking refuge from the consequences of his own moral collapse, and he thought I would be his soft landing. So, you only realized you messed up after you ran out of money, and your mistress betrayed you? I inquired softly, the irony tasting like ash on my tongue. And you came back to the woman you called useless to save you? He started to cry, real tears this time, but they held no power over me. I see you can walk now, Chloe. You look incredible. We could start again. I can help you with your business accounts, he stammered, grasping at the last shreds of his desperate plan. I simply shook my head. No, Carter. You don't get to come back when your karma runs out. You taught me the value of my independence. And you taught me that my greatest strength is rebuilding without you. You chose your path. Now, walk it. I quietly unlatched the security chain, not to let him in, but to emphasize the finality of my decision. I opened the door, just enough to look him squarely in the eye. Find a shelter, Carter. Get help, but never, ever come back here. I closed and relocked the door. I didn't feel joy, just profound exhaustion. I sank back into my chair, taking deep breaths. His ruin wasn't my victory. My victory was the ability to watch his ruin and feel nothing but detachment. The final stroke of justice came a few months later. Jenna, ever the diligent researcher, sent me a news link. Vanessa arrested in multi-state investment fraud scheme. The article detailed how Vanessa had defrauded multiple victims out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The photograph showed her looking exactly as she had during our confrontation smug, but this time, flanked by 2 serious police officers. I read the headline, smiled a small, satisfied smile, and clicked away. The world had dealt with Carter and Vanessa. My job was finished. I was finally, truly done with their drama. The final, satisfying closure delivered by Carter and Vanessa's respective downfalls, allowed me to turn the page completely. I didn't need their ruin to define my success, but it was certainly a tidy ending to that awful chapter. My focus now was purely on creation, creating beautiful design work, creating physical strength, and creating a future that was entirely on my own terms. The woman Carter called useless was now wealthier, healthier, and unequivocally happier than the woman he had abandoned. My professional life had taken an unexpected, deeply fulfilling turn. Having navigated the hostile legal landscape while disabled, I recognized a profound, unmet need. Using the successful framework of my graphic design business, I launched a complementary venture, disability rights and divorce consulting. It was a resource for people, especially women, who found themselves suddenly vulnerable due to medical crises, only to be betrayed or abandoned by their spouses. I offered guides on protecting premarital assets, strategies for documenting neglect, and, most importantly, emotional solidarity. My purpose had crystallized. I was turning my trauma into tangible aid for others. My revenge was not just elegant. It was empowering. And then, there was Daniel. I met him quite accidentally at a conference where I was presenting my new consulting venture. He wasn't a client, but an attorney specializing in medical discrimination cases. He approached me afterward, not with pity or curiosity about my accident, but with genuine admiration for my legal strategy. Daniel was kind, intellectually sharp, and possessed an integrity that was as refreshing as it was rare. He didn't see the scars on my legs, or the memory of the wheelchair. He saw the fierce intelligence that had engineered my freedom. On our first date, I found myself telling him the whole story, not just the facts. But the emotional cost of hearing that single, devastating word, worthless. He listened intently, not interrupting, and when I finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He simply said, "Chloe, you are one of the most valuable, resilient people I have ever met. Anyone who couldn't see that was simply blind to your worth." His words, so simple, yet so profound, were the true antidote to Carter's venom. Daniel never treated me like I was fragile or damaged goods. He treated me like a partner, challenging me in debates and celebrating my accomplishments, no matter how small. From designing a complex new logo to mastering a difficult yoga pose. With him, the final lingering shadow of my past disappeared. I found not a replacement for Carter, but an entirely different and superior kind of love, one built on mutual respect, admiration, and the shared understanding that life is fragile, but human spirit is not. Looking back now, standing tall and strong in the sun-drenched living room that was once a site of such emotional violence, I understood the ultimate truth of my elegant retaliation. It wasn't about the apartment I kept, or the money Carter lost, or even the fact that Vanessa ended up in handcuffs. The true victory, the most satisfying form of revenge, was the complete transformation of myself. I took the raw material of betrayal and pain, and forged a woman who was stronger, more compassionate, and immeasurably more successful than I ever would have been inside that perfect marriage. I proved, not to Carter, but to myself, that the only measure of my worth comes from within. I was not useless. I was the architect of my own magnificent destiny. And that, I realized, with a deep, contented sigh, was everything.